Okay, well, we're going to get started. What we're going to do this morning is review the midterm questions and get into a little depth. So I see we have 9 people here. So the first question. So mainly, let me just clarify what I'm looking for in the answers here. First of all, I'd like you to cite the readings and the materials that we've used in the text. You don't need to use outside materials. You can just use the books and the readings, the articles, videos, etc., as references. So you're not going to need to use citations. I'm assuming that this is what you're using, and I would appreciate that. You don't need to look outside. Except maybe if you're going to look at a mural that isn't in any of these things, you can just give the name of the mural. So what I'm asking you to do is to try to be clear, give detail to back up your arguments. Many people in some of the assignments have been a little bit vague, and I'm asking you to try to be very specific, to try to cite or to quote or paraphrase things that you've read and use examples that are in the text. So the first question, how were Mexican muralists influenced by the 1910 revolution and other uprisings, and what were the objectives of the early mural movement in Mexico? So this is a two-part question. So how were Mexican muralists influenced by the 1910 revolution? So we could look at this. What were some of the ways that the revolution influenced all Mexicans? And again, why did artists come together as artists? How did they come together? So this would be one of the things we could look at. How are they influenced? And what were those influences? We could see that the 1910 revolution was a huge uprising, overthrowing an established order that had been in place for 90 years, you could say, after the, or well, no, not 90 years, but yeah, about 90 years after Mexican independence, after the end of colonialism, as a new form of neo-colonialism and a semi-feudal state emerges, with many people forced to become peons, living on haciendas, big ranches, plantations. We can see the growth of small industry around the turn of the century, but mainly an agricultural country. And the overthrow of this system frees people from peonage, from slavery, from this form of oppression, and is very liberating in many senses, that it breaks up the established order that hardens and comes into place. The científicos that surrounded Porfirio Diaz had created a justification for this type of lifestyle and this type of government. And the revolution breaks many of these myths and breaks this, not just the economic and social and political structures, but also the ideas that they held in place. Some of these ideas were used to justify this inequality. So the 1910 revolution really breaks this open and leads into question, again, everything in society. You see anarchist movements, the Communist Party emerging, agrarian movements, all kinds of religious movements, all kinds of movements emerging out of this revolution, and mainly a nationalist tendency to try to redefine and reestablish Mexican identity, to create a portrait of who a Mexican is, where Mexicans came from, and how this would be portrayed in images. So this was an important role that the muralists played by trying to create this image, to trying to paint this portrait of who a Mexican is. So many Mexican muralists were influenced by the revolution, by this impetus of this groundswell of excitement and energy from the bottom to overthrow the elites. So using art to do this is very complicated. So they were influenced by the idea of overthrow, this idea, this upswell of energy, of excitement, of movement. But how do you employ this? How do you make this work? And we can see that the beginning of the mural movement in the 1920s, after the revolutionary fighting and the establishment of the 1917 Constitution, many of the muralists began to take this impetus, this movement for change and for recreating Mexican society, and try to use this from their, what we could say, their trinchera, their battle lines, their battle post, that they saw themselves as revolutionaries, as having to keep this fight going on, but using the skills that they had as weapons, as artists. So Jose Vasconcelos, by commissioning murals and create public art, would put a public face on the revolution, would create images that would portray the revolutionary ideas. So the influences of the revolution we can see in many of these murals, that a lot of the images in the murals are kind of recreating the things that happened against the historical roots of the revolution that go all the way back to the Spanish conquest. So by creating these links, the artists were able to give a historical context to this uprising. So these are some of the things that influence them. And what other uprisings might we be referring to? Well, we could look at the 1917 Russian Revolution, which was a huge event in world history, because this, similar to the Mexican Revolution, an uprising from the bottom that overthrows an entrenched leadership, in this case, a feudal society. And for the first time in human history, we see the beginnings of a socialist government, a different way of looking at government and the distribution of wealth and land. So the 1917 revolution was huge in that it proposes a radical solution to inequality and to many of the issues that many countries in the world are facing. And this had a huge influence on Mexican muralists and artists all over the world, because one of the things that comes out of the Russian Revolution is also a redefinition of roles, of the roles of workers, of individuals. So in each of these cases, artists ask, okay, here's this new change in society. What are we supposed to do? Previously, artists would make paintings and create art for sale. They lived through the sale of art, either to collectors, to museums, and art was viewed by the people that had the resources to see it. We see painters doing everything from painting murals in taquerias and cantinas to public buildings, but these commissions were mainly on a commercial basis. So in the 1920s, we see Jose Vasconcelos beginning a public education project, a massive literacy project to teach Mexicans not only to read and write, but also cultural literacy, to learn about their culture and their history, and using the public art, murals in public buildings, to give a face to the revolution and to provide the means for Mexicans to understand a visual language which also supported this changing curriculum. So the Russian Revolution proposed public art as a valid and necessary form of art, and proposed to artists that their duty was to create art that would support the ideas of the revolution, that would portray working class people in a positive light, would show the process of work, the productive process, as a positive thing, as a necessary part of society. So you could see how the Russian Revolution also influenced these artists by creating this an example of public art and how it could be used. Now, did Vasconcelos himself reference this when he was creating the commissions for these mural projects? It's likely that he did. But we could see that these ideas in other places in the world are also coming up. The idea of public art as massive building begins, of public institutions, and a wave of nationalism all through the world arising. So some of the objectives of the early mural movement, what are they? What were they trying to accomplish? Well, we could see the principal goal, we could see maybe emphasized in Vasconcelos's book, La Raza Cósmica, was to create a positive image of Mexican identity, to paint a portrait of Mexico that could be shared, which would allow Mexicans to see themselves in a positive light, to understand their historical roots, the historical roots of the revolution, how this came about, a vision for a new society that might emerge, new relationships, changes that were in process. Again, a redefinition of who a Mexican is. So some of the objectives were to create a public art movement, to create solidarity among artists, so that artists could define their role and could, instead of competing, could work together. We can see the syndicate of artists and cultural workers. Even the concept of calling themselves cultural workers put themselves within the working class as proletarians. Again, people who were using their labor in a positive way, that were part of not elite intellectuals removed from the working class, but people who are working for a clear objective. So these were some of the objectives. So we could see cultural literacy, painting Mexican identity, Mexican history, creating solidarity among artists, redefining their role as cultural workers rather than elite intellectuals. Can anyone think of any other objectives? We could look at the portrayal of women and working people. Again, this was important as we see redefining the role of manual labor and the dignity of manual labor. The role of women, giving dignity to the role of women and emphasizing their role in the productive process. Anything else? It's kind of quiet out there. Can somebody type something so we can move on? Is this clear? Okay, good. Hold on, battery's running out on my computer. Okay, the next question is based on the interview. How did Diego Rivera view the role of an artist in society, and how is this expressed in one of his murals? So I put the PDF. I'm going to put a link to the YouTube video. For those of you that speak Spanish, you can hear Rivera talk in his own words. This is based on an interview that he gave with his daughter Ruth towards the end of his life. She asked him, she had a tape recorder, and she asked him, Dad, can you explain to me and my friends what's the role of an artist in society? And he goes on for about an hour. And this is very revealing in terms of Rivera describing how he understood the role of an artist in society. And what I'm asking you to do is to give reference of one of the murals of how this might be, how he put this into practice. So it doesn't have to be specific or literal. I'm just asking you to kind of look deeply at one of the murals and use it as an example. You'll see in his response, he talks about his motivations, and again also justifies and expresses the way he understands the role of art. And this kind of goes against the definitions that many other people had put out. Rivera talks about art as an important form of nutrition for the imagination, again, that he says is important as food and nourishment. He looks at art as a form of propaganda. And what is propaganda? This is kind of a dirty word in English, meaning sort of a biased form of expression. But actually, in Spanish, it has a different connotation, and in other countries has a different connotation, that propaganda means publicity, right? Is putting your views out there. And Rivera is arguing that there's no objectivity, that all of us are biased in one way or another by our own experience, by our lived experience, by the context that we work and live in, and that artists should express their views as they feel them, as they see them, and not try to be objective observers like a journalist. So he's pushing artists to be committed and to show their commitment. So you can see this in the interview. And so I'm asking you to look at the interview and use this as a basis, because this is where we hear Rivera's words, probably for the first time. This is where he actually lays it out. So is this clear?
I have a question actually.
Sure.
So an example that I'm trying to get out, because I did further read into the interview with his daughter,
Uh-huh.
and also going back to his book, how he felt like paintings and art was kind of used to lie to the public, and to put this wall to see, to not let them see the reality of their society.
Mm-hmm.
So the mural that I was trying to use was the Night of the Rich, and then say how he didn't just do that. That mural was not just to reflect the nice life of what it means to have money, and therefore he also did the mural of the Night of the Poor, and how and the reflection of both of them. I don't know if that makes sense.
That's a perfect example. That's a really good example, because he's depicting in visual terms the inequalities in society, just in something so simple as how people spend their evening, right?
Yeah.
Some people eating with their family, whatever they can get, and other people drinking champagne and kind of having a good old time at the expense of others.
Yeah.
So he's using his art here. This would be a great example, because he's putting out there in visual terms his ideological the ideological framework he's proposing for understanding, again, what Marx proposes in the Communist Manifesto, the class struggle between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie. So he's making it very clear in concrete terms, not in abstract ideological terms, but in very simple terms, that while some people are suffering and working, other people are enjoying the profits that they make off of others. So it's a great example.
Good. Thanks.
Anybody else? So are we able to discuss, hold on, let me move the chat over here. Any of his murals, or a specific, you can use any of his murals. Any of his murals, And it doesn't have to be so specific. I mean, you can use any of the murals that would express or would be an example of what he's talking about in the interview. And so almost any mural of his could work because all of them express these ideas again. So I hope this is clear. And I think this, if you read the interview, I think it'll be very clear what he's saying, the role of the artist in society. He mentions it going back to the time of cave paintings and looks at an historical overview of the role of artists in society, what their role is in capitalism, and what it might be in this new society that he's proposing. So this interview had a huge impact. It was put out on a recording. I recorded this from an LP that was in the library, and it's been spread widely all through Mexico and used as an educational tool. Clear? Is this clear? Okay. This next one is very subjective. Describe the differences in the approach to art of the following artists. How did their artistic vision differ? Now, this is very subjective, and there's kind of no right and wrong answer, but what I'm asking you to do is kind of dig down and try to describe what was their approach to art and how did it differ one from the other. So how would you look at this? Well, you could look in the readings and to see their quotes from them, or look at the things that they did. How did their paths differ? What was their goal? Rivera, who partied with millionaires and movie stars and kind of basked in the glamour, seeing himself as a rebel, but rubbing elbows with Henry Ford and Rockefeller and the presidents and other celebrities while maintaining his revolutionary ideas. He also used very clear images, very, very realistic images, right? Not so much abstraction or things that took a lot of unraveling to understand. He tried to use very clear, even though he was capable of this, he wanted to make his messages very clear and concrete. Orozco, again, comes from a very different background, very different type of influences, and you can see in his work a different way of putting forth his message. While Rivera was at times in and out of the Communist Party, Orozco was never a member of the Communist Party and was more of an anarchist who shared and worked alongside Rivera in many political organizations, but didn't share his political beliefs and really belonged to a different group of intellectuals and artists than Rivera, as he allied himself with different forces. And we can see in Orozco's work a different form of commentary in making his statements. Siqueiros, we can see Siqueiros was a hardened Communist Party functionary, was at the front lines of marches, and every time he got the chance to talk in the microphone, he would say, "Workers, follow me, let's rise up." And again, never wanted to hang out with millionaires and celebrities, and allied himself with the working class. And while he talked about using concrete images, very, very simple visual images that would be accessible to the working class, in practice, if you look at his work, it's very complex and very difficult to unravel it. He thought that Rivera's work was a form of cartoon, that it was too simple. It was that workers needed to be challenged and needed to see these complex images and be pushed further. So we can see this contradiction between them that resulted in many arguments and debates and led to debates all over Mexico about the correct way to do this. Frida Kahlo, not a muralist, who painted easel paintings, against which might have gone against the ideas of the larger movement, but maybe because of her physical problems, it was difficult for her to paint murals, or maybe the male artist didn't allow her, or for whatever reason she didn't create any murals. And we can look at the things that she did and the way that she used her art to make political statements that was very different than the male artists, both in the way that she executed the art, her ideas about what art should be for, even though she shared many of Rivera's ideas in a larger conceptual sense, in that art should be to inform people, should be politically motivated, etc. Her work was more introspective and political, and she was making her political statements in a very different way. So there's no, again, this is going to be just about your own perception. There's no right or wrong answer to any of these, but it's just to try to express yourselves, to look in, to see what you see, how you would describe these, and try to make a coherent argument. Is that clear? Okay. How did the Zapatista movement of the 1990s transform Mexico? Watch the film, The Sixth Sun, Mayan Uprising in Chiapas, to answer this question. So the Zapatista movement begins really in the 1960s as the Mexican, what's called here the Mexican miracle, is a transformation of Mexican agriculture, creating agribusiness, kind of an industrialization of agriculture. We can see the consolidation of land into large plantations and large industrial farms, which pushes many small farmers off the land through taxation and pressure. We can see industrialization of agriculture is, instead of having 1,000 one-acre farms, having 1,000-acre farms. Many small farmers are transformed from being small farmers to being farm workers. And we can see that in the state of Chiapas, there's a large region, the Lacandon jungle, which is a nature preserve, but also a very mountainous area with rainforests that became a haven for several Mayan communities, groups of Mayan people who wanted to step out of the mainstream society. You could see stepping out of Babylon. They're stepping out of the mainstream communities based on the old ways of life, to revive Mayan culture, Mayan traditions, but in a modern context. So they jettisoned some of the examples, some of the ways of the traditional Maya, trying to create sustainable communities that would not be linked to the mainstream society. And we can see, as people begin to hear about these communities in some of the neighboring, in Veracruz and in other neighboring states, many of these young displaced farmers, farm workers, hear about this and begin to migrate towards this free space, this space that is welcoming to Mayan people, and kind of this kind of experiment in creating a new way of living outside the confines of capitalist society. So in the 1960s, we see these communities beginning to flourish, making links with the liberation theology movement in San Cristobal de las Casas in Chiapas and other places. Chiapas, in the very south of Mexico, is one of the states that was left behind in much of the economic development in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution had little impact in Chiapas, that many of the relationships went way back more towards colonial times. And we see large landowners controlling large, vast estates of land, very little social mobility. And the Samuel Ruiz, the Archbishop of Chiapas, was linked to the liberation theology movement, which we're going to read about much later on in the course, which was a movement of revolutionary Catholics who were reinterpreting the Bible. They were linking the Catholic Church or their parishes, their grassroots communities that they formed, to a way of thinking, a way of looking at the Bible as a treatise about rebellion. And they looked at Jesus Christ as a figure who was a rebel, who was against the inequality, who spoke against greed, against the unequal distribution of wealth, and about the idea of consumerism, of people desiring physical objects and encouraging solidarity among communities. So the Zapatista movement emerges in the 1980s after the massacre in 1969 in 1968 in La Plaza Tlatelolco in Mexico, where the Mexican army opens fire on student protesters in 1968 as students were out protesting on the eve of the Mexican Olympics in 1968. The Olympics going to be held in Mexico for the first time. Protesters took this as a chance to put their movements out there, to spread their ideas, and we see protests all through Mexico City. The Mexican military opens fire on one of these protests as they pass through the Plaza Tlatelolco, opening fire with machine guns on the crowd. And this leads to a huge transformation of protest movements in general in Mexico, as this is definitely discouraging people from coming out in the street and protesting. And many student protesters at this moment leave the university and dedicate themselves to armed struggle. Many of these people who were either a part of this or inspired by this began to move and create armed resistance movements throughout Mexico, and some of them arrive in Chiapas to join up with these rebel communities that exist in the Lacandon jungle. And we can see in the film, it talks about, we can see the narratives of the Zapatistas of how they came to kind of join and lead these movements and end up as followers, and Subcomandante Marcos as a spokesperson. So the Zapatista movement of the 1990s, the Zapatista uprising occurs on the date of the enactment of the NAFTA treaty in 1994. A treaty which creates a trade union, a alliance between Canada, the United States, and Mexico, which creates a series of economic rules or regulations that will be shared between the three countries. In order to have free trade, they have to have the same economic regulation. And to do this, the Mexican government annuls Article 27 of the Constitution, which legalizes the creation of ejidos, or collective lands. And this was one of the gains of the revolution, to redistribute land, not only putting it in the hands of small farmers, but by creating these agricultural collectives called ejidos. And the ejidos are a way of creating community holdings. Now, what's the difference between public land and an ejido, or communal land? Again, we can look at Dolores Park in San Francisco. This is public land that belongs to everybody, but if you wanted to grow corn there, you couldn't do that. Right? So the ejido is more of an agricultural collective where the members of the collective don't own the land, that they can't buy it or sell it, but they can work it and profit from it. And it's passed on through the community, through generations. So the elimination of the ejido allows for the privatization of these lands that can be bought and sold in order to pay debts. And this creates, the Zapatistas see this as the beginning of the death of traditional cultures. As corn grown in Iowa can compete with the heirloom varieties of corn grown by individual farmers in Mexico, they feel that they won't be able to compete, and that this way of life, the ejidos are not only a form of agricultural production, but also a way of maintaining traditional agricultural processes, but also the ways of governing. That who would control the ejido? Who would direct the ejido? Again, the ejido would be normally led by elders in the community who had lived, who had had these experiences, who had the trust of people in the community. And their agricultural practices were not always the most productive, but were following the traditional means, which were a way of maintaining these traditional cultures. So the Zapatistas saw that the creation of the NAFTA treaty and the institutions that would come out of this would eventually destroy their way of life. And they lead an uprising against the government as a way of publicizing their grievances. So how does the movement transform Mexican culture? Well, one of the things we can see in the film, and by the way, the interviewer in many of the interviews there is me. My father was a filmmaker who asked me to help him on this, and I traveled to Chiapas and made contacts there through the Liberation Theology Church in San Francisco, who had sent several priests to Chiapas at this time, and through them we were able to get access to many of these communities. So you'll see this in the film. This was filmed in 1994, shortly after the uprising. So in this film, you can see how the armed occupation of San Cristobal de las Casas and several other cities leads to huge media coverage, how the Zapatistas use the media, use the internet, which was not very advanced at that time, to spread the word and to create a form of protection from civil society, because there had been many uprisings throughout Mexican history, but many of them had been put down by the army. But because the cameras were focused there, it was difficult for the army to come and wipe them out as they had in other places. So also the protection of the church helped them in this case. So how did the movement transform Mexican culture? Well, we can see one of the ways is it showed that the indigenous cultures in Mexico were not dead, as many people had believed, as many people were led to believe. And we could see, how is this depicted in art? Well, we could see that part of Porfirio Diaz's work in creating a new culture was to create to propose the myth of the Aztec past. Even the word Aztec, we can see it is a creation that the word Aztec emerged, or Azteca emerges in the 19th century from Jesuit priests who were translating and rewriting the history of Mexico. And the people we call now Aztecs called themselves Mexica, M-E-X-I-C-A, very similar to the name Mexico. And they wanted to distinguish between the Aztec past and the Aztec present. You can see this depicted, the kind of the myth of the Aztec past depicted in the calendars you find in bakeries and butcher shops. The Aztec warrior holding the princess in front of the two mountains. And the idea was to create a differentiation between the brave ancestors and the misery of indigenous people that they lived every day in modern Mexico. So what the Zapatista movement does is to show how indigenous cultures have survived in Mexico, how many of the values are still present in Mexican society, and to push forward a new alternative to capitalism, somewhere between capitalism and socialism, is what many people in Latin America are calling the fourth road, which is to explore other forms of collective management of land and resources. So we could see that after the Zapatista insurrection, we could see a new understanding of indigenous identity in Mexico that takes root in the exposure that they receive, but also the way they're able to create new institutions and create. In Chiapas, still we have a laboratory which is exploring new forms of social organization. So you can look into this, and the film talks about this. Again, the way that Mayan identity and even hyphenization begins in Mexico as part of the nationalism of the 20s and 30s was to create a kind of a homogenous Mexican society. Oh no, we're all Mexicans from the south to the north. We could see the Zapatista rebellion leads to people distinguishing themselves in a hyphenization, people calling themselves Mayan Mexican or Yaqui Mexican or Purepecha or other forms of ethnic identification, recognizing their indigenous roots. So is this clear? I'm sorry to go on so long about it, but I just wanted to give some context. Is this clear?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay. So how was the representation of women and their participation in art in the 20s and 30s transformed how was the representation of women and their participation in art transformed in the 1920s and 1930s in Mexico? So to look at this, we can look at the examples of Aurora Reyes, who, again, who is, if you search for her on the internet, you're going to find very few references and very few books and very few writings about her, which is suggestive that she wasn't very well known and didn't receive the same type of attention, but she was the first woman muralist, someone who really fought with the men to gain a place. There was a lot of sexism within the movement, a lot of macho posturing that made it difficult for women to participate in this process, even though they shared the ideas of equality and including women and creating positive representations of women in their art. They didn't give much space to women to actually participate. So we can look at some of the representations of women and how this transformed. We can see Rivera and others were inspired by the image of the Tehuanas, of the women of Tehuanacan, of southern Oaxaca, who were part of a matriarchal society, which continues to this day, and the representation of women as providers, their economic role as very strong figures, their concepts of beauty, the aesthetics that they developed. We can see the representation of women as workers, again, women as essential to the survival of Mexican people, of their role in the family, but also their role as workers. So this is transformed in the 1920s and 30s as women begin to assume a role, but also with the advent of industrial capitalism, women integrated into the workforce in new ways. And this leads to the role of women in, we'll see later, in the maquila industry and assembly and industrial work. So I think this one is fairly clear. Looking at some of the examples, you could look at the example of Frida Kahlo, who really transformed the representation of women, again, by putting forth her self-portraits that highlight her unibrow, something that many women would try to hide. She's showing how the supposed imperfections or things that women tried to erase were a sign of also natural beauty, that it was important for women to express themselves. And Frida Kahlo herself, in her form of dressing, tried to express, again, the way women could represent themselves, to represent their culture and their history. Frida Kahlo, a woman who had the resources to wear anything she wanted. She could have worn French designer clothing and decided to use her body as a form of expressing her ideas and her own culture, and pride in her own culture made a huge impact that's actually being felt today in a very strong way. And even the image of Frida has come to represent a form of self-expression, and today has a very strong impact. So is this clear? Yeah? Okay. So the last question is probably the hardest, but it won't be graded. So describe the topic of your research paper and explain how the topic is relevant to the material presented in the class. I don't know yet is not a valid answer. This is not for credit, just a reference to give feedback about the topic. So this leads us to what is the research paper about. So this is a chance to kind of stretch your wings, to take some of the things we've looked at the class and use it as a way to explore things that are interesting to you. So does the research paper have to be about Mexican muralism? No, it doesn't. So many people have used this as an example, for instance, to look at graffiti artists, to look at rappers, to look at independent film, to look at performance art, all kinds of things. So it's a way to kind of stretch your wings. And the topic of the paper, I'm asking you to put it out here so I can give you some feedback about it. Maybe suggest some references or some places you could look, or to push you to narrow it a little bit. I'm going to add that here that what I don't want is a biography of Diego Rivera or Frida Kahlo, but to do some analysis about the impact of their work. It's interesting, just as a side note, Frida Kahlo during her life was not very well known in Mexico and throughout the world. She was mainly known as Diego Rivera's wife because few people had a chance to see her work. Although her work was shown in museums in several parts of the world, in Paris and New York, a few people had a chance to see these, only people who could go to the museums. We didn't have the internet, we didn't have these picture books and things like that. So people didn't really know her art until the 1980s, when Madonna began to purchase Frida Kahlo's work and talk about her, and the publication of the biography by Hayden Herrera, and later the film Frida, and then through the internet, this is how Frida's work is pushed. And as a side note, in 1978, Galeria de la Raza in San Francisco, a very small community art gallery, a storefront that's actually not there anymore on 24th and Bryant, was offered a traveling exhibition of Frida Kahlo's work, 1978, and Enrique Chagoya, who teaches at Stanford right now, who is director of the gallery, thought that his gallery was too small for this show, and he called SF MoMA, San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, to offer them the show. And SF MoMA said, "Thanks, Enrique, for this. Tell Frida to send us her portfolio and we'll get back to her." meaning they had no idea who she was. So it wasn't until the 1980s that she became an important reference. So this is something you could look into, kind of the Frida Mania, and how did Frida become known, and what was her impact while she was alive, and how did that change afterwards? I don't know. It's a topic that I've been following, and it might be interesting for you. So, anybody have any questions about this research paper, and what's
yeah. So in the module it says to explore one artist or group of artists, but are you saying that we can just choose any topic though?
Yeah, any topic related to art. When I'm saying artist in the more broad sense of it. Maybe I'll change to make it clear.
Yeah.
But so I'm talking about artists. So I could see, many people have written about rappers, for instance, or people have looked at Los Tigres del Norte.
Okay. That makes more sense.
Things like, or writers, for instance. One student wrote about the book La Reina del Sur that later became a movie and a song and a telenovela and transformed into something way different than where it started. But the idea of this story of the women gangsters, and people looked at Jenny Rivera and Lupillo Rivera and Bad Bunny and all kinds of people as artists, right? So it's a chance to explore whatever interests you, whatever kind of path this class is taking you down. So you can be brave. And what I'm asking you to do here is to show me what you want to do so I can give you some feedback and help you channel it into the right place. So just so you don't waste your energy. Okay?
Yeah,
so
that makes sense.
Yeah, so this won't be graded. This answer will not be graded. It's just a way for you to ask me a question. Here's what I'm thinking, and what do you think? Right? So we can have a little give and take about it. Okay?
Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Sure. Anything else anybody would like to cover here? So I'm expecting you to put what you can, to try to be specific, not be vague, and let me know if you have any questions or anything is not clear. You can email me. We can video conference offline if you're nervous about it or if you have any issues. So anything else? Well, I thank you for spending your Saturday morning with me here. And so just sign off and say goodbye, or ask me any other questions here.
Thank you. Have a good week.
You too. Thank you for coming.
Yeah, of course.